Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on Trent Horn's channel, the Counsel of Trent. This purports to be him asking a question that atheists cannot answer. And he's a proper credentialed philosopher, not some amateur turned YouTuber like me, so this one has gotta be good, right? On to the video! But first, a word from our sponsor, Surfshark. Are you worried about privacy on the internet in this day and age? If not, you probably should be. And one of the most important tools in the privacy toolbox is Surfshark VPN. Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network which allows you to appear to be connected to the internet from any location where they have a server. By connecting through Surfshark, you can access streaming services from different geographic locations. This means you may have access to additional libraries of movies and TV shows that aren't available in your home area. And really, given the current political climate, making it look like you're connected through Canada or Europe might be a good idea for my American viewers right about now. But that's not all they do. With their Clean Web 2.0 features, you can automatically block ads, reject unwanted cookies without fumbling through that pop-up first, get alerts when a website was the target of a data breach, and block malware. Like, seriously, if Clean Web 2.0 were the only product they offered, that would be more than worth the price just for getting rid of the stupid cookies pop-up. Surfshark VPN adds an extra layer of encryption to your devices, keeping you secure on public networks. I always connect to public networks through Surfshark. Surfshark VPN is easy to use and simple to install. They don't monitor, track, or store your data, and it works on phones, tablets, and laptops with no extra fees. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out completely risk-free. My viewers get a special promo where you can get an extra 4 months added to your subscription for free. Go to surfshark.com/rhino or use code Rhino at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Again, that's surfshark.com/RHINO for an extra 4 months for free. This is a limited time offer, so sign up today. And remember, by signing up for Surfshark VPN, you're helping to support my channel, so thank you.
And today I want to talk about atheism, or a part of atheism that I think has a fundamental flaw. But to understand why, I need to talk about something else called the God of the Gaps objection.
So, the thing that pretty much every argument for God eventually breaks down into? Sure, why not?
So basically it goes like this. God of the Gaps objection claims that arguments for the existence of God, they all fail because they all essentially say the same thing. Here's something we can't explain, or here is a gap in our knowledge. God explains the gap in our knowledge, therefore God exists.
Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you want to get your Rhino fix in before... Ah, shit, there's more, isn't there?
In other words, you can't argue in this way. I don't know what caused X, therefore God exists. That's a bad argument.
Correct. And it is basically every argument for God. The cosmological argument, we don't know what caused the universe, therefore God. The moral argument, we don't know what could be used as an objective standard for morality, therefore God. Argument from consciousness, we don't know how consciousness emerged, therefore God. Honestly, the only argument from God that I can think of that might not boil down to an argument from ignorance is the ontological argument, which is basically, I defined God as existing, therefore he exists, which is completely nonsensical.
Now, the unexplained thing, it might be morality or the beginning of the universe or the existence of something rather than nothing. Whatever it is, atheists say we don't want to rush to a supernatural explanation because we might miss an undiscovered or unknown natural explanation.
That's not entirely it. It's more that an explanation has to have some actual evidence behind it, and by its very nature, the supernatural just won't ever meet that bar.
On the one hand, I agree that arguments for God should start not from what we don't know, but from what we do know.
And that's a tactic that can be used to pretend like whatever argument you're using is not an argument from ignorance, but it will usually wind up back there eventually. Like the cosmological argument. We do know that the Big Bang is a thing that happened. That will often be included as a part of the cosmological argument. The universe had a beginning. Then, a bunch of unsubstantiated assumptions get added onto it, so we can say that the beginning must have been caused by something spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and immeasurably powerful. And that must be God, because we don't know what else it could be. Also, we don't know why the cause had to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and immeasurably powerful, but that seems cromulent, so we run with it. And while we're at it, we just need to make sure to never acknowledge the existence of cosmological models that don't actually wind up at a beginning for the universe in the sense this argument requires.
They should start with effects we observe, and then reason to a cause for those effects. and then show that that cause must have divine attributes.
Yeah, that's basically what I just said. Apologists are so predictable.
On the other hand, I worry that atheists who lean too much into the God of the Gaps objection, they'll end up making atheism as unfalsifiable as some religions.
Okay, I'm just going to come right out and say it. Atheism is unfalsifiable, at least in as much that that's even a coherent statement. Outside of a formal debate setting, atheism is, by its nature, a response to a claim. You claim that God exists. I don't believe your claim. I don't need to prove that your God doesn't exist in order to justify my non-belief in your claim, especially if I don't actually care whether or not you continue to believe in God after our conversation. But if you want to convince me that your claim is correct, then yeah, you need to bring something more to the table than we don't know X, therefore God. So in one sense, yes, atheism is unfalsifiable, but that is entirely a function of the unfalsifiability of the God that is not being believed in.
Or they won't be able to answer this question. What would prove God exists?
Admittedly, that is a tricky question. I honestly can't think of anything God could do that I wouldn't first assume was something like a hallucination. But do you know who does know? God. If the Christian God is real, he knows exactly what it would take to convince every single person on earth of his existence. And according to the Bible, he wants to convince every single person on earth of his existence. Since he has not done so, it is safe to conclude that the God that is described by the Bible just doesn't exist.
A few examples I've heard from atheists include healing an amputated limb through prayer, rearranging the stars to say God exists, or discovering on the human genetic code that our genetic code says made by Yahweh on it.
Yeah, some of those are better than others, and honestly, I'm a fan of the healing one. If it were just a fact of life that Christians had the healing powers that the Bible says that they have, it would make the case for Christianity a whole lot more compelling. The reason amputees are the go-to example is because that's one of the harder medical conditions to heal through trickery. It's fairly easy for faith healers to have a plant in the audience that is on crutches or in a wheelchair who will then walk unassisted after being prayed for, but it would actually be impressive if they could cause amputees to regrow their limbs in front of their live audience. And if that were just a thing that all Christians could do, and it was a power that was exclusive to Christians, it would go a long way to assuaging the doubts of the hardened skeptics. I don't think this would necessarily count as definitive proof, like even if I grant that it proves the supernatural, it could be something like the malicious deity of another religion making it look like Christianity is true in order to prevent that other religion's growth, but that's one of those we can cross that bridge when we come to it sort of things. It's a bit of a moot point until such a time as Christians actually have the powers that they're supposed to have.
Evan Vales says that if all the stars realign to spell the words Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, which is what God wrote on the wall at Belshazzar's feast in the book of Daniel, then, quote, that would convince me of theism or polytheism. No other explanation is remotely plausible.
I see what you're getting at, and hey, guess what? I agree. A more likely explanation for the stars being rearranged like that is that I am hallucinating or delusional, though that certainly becomes a harder sell if the professional astronomy community confirms such an event, so maybe that would do the trick for me. Again, I don't know if that would convince me. It's possible, but God knows for sure exactly what would, and he has failed to do that thing, thus demonstrating that he either doesn't actually care all that much about whether or not I come to repentance, or that he doesn't exist.
Doug from the Pine Creek channel says that since the prophet Elijah could call down fire to light a soaked sacrifice in the book of Kings, and he could one-up the prophets of Baal by doing that, then Christians should be able to prove Christianity is true by just setting a wet napkin on fire through prayer.
Well, this would once again not necessarily prove Christianity. The fact that it's not something that Christians can do is rather odd. In the Bible, God is happy to show off in order to prove himself. Hell, the whole plagues of Egypt thing was him doing exactly that. He explicitly stopped Pharaoh from letting the Israelites go so that he could continue showing off to them. Though, honestly, given that a lot of the times God showing off meant a bunch of innocent people died, it's probably for the best that he doesn't do that anymore.
Now, some of the examples are better than others, but they all share the same flaw. I would ask the non-believers who offer these examples, why would these particular things convince you that God exists?
As I've already said a couple times, I'm not sure that they would, but they'd certainly be a step in the right direction.
I suspect ultimately this is the reasoning. I don't know what caused a limb to be healed, or the stars to move, or the napkin to catch fire. I can't imagine a natural cause. Therefore, God must have done it.
Yep. Which is why I typically respond to these sorts of inquiries with the "I don't know what would convince me, but God does" line. I can understand why apologists might not like that answer, but I've honestly never seen one of them address it with anything more than a dismissal, usually with a jab about how arrogant it is to expect God to personally provide you with a demonstration. Who do you think you are that you can command God to perform at your whim? Which is fine, I'm actually not that arrogant, but that does basically confirm that the God described by the Bible does not exist, because that God gave people personal experiences all the damn time, and he wants everyone to believe in him. So it seems reasonable to expect that such a God would continue to provide demonstrations similar to those that he did in the past.
In other words, they commit the God of the gaps fallacy in their hypothetical evidence. I don't know what caused X, therefore God exists.
Mm-hmm. And remember, folks, that's a bad reason to believe in God.
Here's a blatant example of this from my debate with atheist Dan Barker. When I asked Barker what would convince him to give up atheism, he said that if I prayed and told him what was written inside an envelope he had on stage with him, then he would believe God exists. He also claimed that since God is all-knowing, I could pray to God, and God would tell me what's written on the card. Here is my reply.
So let me understand, we have 15 seconds left. If Jesus appeared and performed a miracle for you, you would ask God to apologize. But if I could do a magic trick, you would become a Christian.
It's not a magic trick, Trent.
I mean, suppose I really did guess what was written on the envelope, inside the envelope. Would Dan Barker convert? No way.
Yeah, you're probably right. But it is quite telling that Christians don't actually have the ability to do any of the stuff that the Bible says they should be able to do. Granted, I don't think that the Bible says you'll be able to ask God about the contents of envelopes, but it does say that you'll be able to heal people. And what's more, it doesn't say that they'll only be healed if they have faith or if the faith healer has faith or something like that. It just says that they will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. Not they'll recover if they also believe, not the person performing the miracle has to be a particular denomination or something, just that those who believe will be able to heal with the laying on of hands. It is explicitly called a sign in this case, meaning that these are things that Christians will be able to do in order to convince non-Christians of the truth of Christianity while spreading the gospel. Granted, the use of the word signs is one of the signs that this part of the Book of Mark is a later addition, as the Book of Mark is very much anti-signs and wonders. That's more of a John type of thing. And Trent is Catholic, so he probably is willing to treat the Bible with quite a bit more nuance than the typical apologist that can be found on my channel, which, as an atheist, I appreciate. But if I put my admittedly Protestant Christian hat back on for a moment, I never understood how anyone could believe that God had a hand in writing a book that was supposed to be his message to us, but he treated it as sort of a side project where if somebody made a mistake with it, it's fine. Humans will probably be able to figure it out. Like, no, this is the most important book in human history, and it contains God's most important message to humans. So why would he not carefully choose every single word and make sure that the whole thing says exactly what he wants it to say? As much as I prefer Christians who are willing to treat the Bible as more of an interesting anthropological artifact rather than the inerrant word of God, I've never actually understood that position.
He'd think, well, maybe it was a lucky guess. Or maybe before the debate, when he was distracted, I opened the envelope, I read it, and then I resealed it. That would be way more likely than a miracle.
Yep. And that's exactly why I can't believe in miracles on the basis of testimony written down thousands of years ago.
Or at best, Dan would think that I have some unknown natural or supernatural power to read hidden messages. But not that God exists.
Yeah. And that is directly relevant to a lot of the arguments that Christian apologists often use. Even if I grant that, say, the cosmological argument proves that a supernatural being created the universe, it does nothing to get us to the God of the Bible.
So I think this shows we have a double standard among some atheists, specifically among those who dismiss classical arguments for God as essentially saying, I don't know, therefore God. They dismiss all the classic proofs, I don't know, therefore God. But then they say you could prove God exists through one of their hypothetical examples, like guessing a card in an envelope, which is also a case of I don't know, therefore God.
I think this might be the most that I have ever agreed with an apologist in any of my videos. Yes, that is a double standard, and that's why I don't use that particular argument against God. And I appreciate that Trent said that this was among some atheists. It's always good to see acknowledgement that atheism is not monolithic. As much as I've brought up the tens of thousands of denominations of Christianity, I would wager that there are significantly more versions of atheism. But of course, the main difference is that atheism doesn't actually have a God figure that explicitly stated that atheist unity is how you can know that atheism is true.
I mean, what's the difference between an amputated limb coming into existence from nothing, proving God exists, and a universe coming into nothing, coming into being from nothing? Wouldn't that also prove God exists if that's what happened?
Not necessarily. Depends on what you mean by nothing, I suppose. But the main difference that I can see here is that we would actually be able to witness a limb growing back with our own eyes. When it comes to the beginning of the universe, we are constrained to using our knowledge of how physics operates to construct mathematical models for what happened before the Big Bang. And our knowledge of how physics operates is such that we can't actually be sure what happened before the Big Bang as of this moment. We've got several plausible ideas, but until that question is answered definitively, that is a pretty big difference between these two scenarios.
The bottom line is that no matter what wildly fantastic scenario an atheist proposes that would allegedly prove God exists, you could always ask him, how do you know that there isn't an unknown natural explanation for that scenario?
We can't know. Same goes for the argument for God. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
What's interesting is that some atheists have even conceded that nothing could prove God exists, since you could always imagine another unknown explanation being the true cause of whatever thing you observe.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, even in the most extreme of cases, hallucination will be a more likely explanation than the existence of an actual supernatural entity. Of course, if the God that you believe in is all-powerful and all-knowing, I'm sure he could come up with something more convincing than my feeble atheist brain can, so we once again wind up back at a place where, if God wanted to convince me, he could, but he has chosen not to.
So it seems like you can either have an extreme God of the gaps view towards the arguments for God and write them off, or be open to God existing, but you can't be both.
If you acknowledge that all of the arguments for God do, in fact, make use of the God of the gaps fallacy, then yes, you are correct, because this once again brings us to a point where the all-powerful, all-knowing being that you believe in should be capable of providing evidence of his existence that does not run afoul of fallacious reasoning in order to work, so the fact that he has not is pretty good evidence of his non-existence.
Instead, atheists, they should just be open to the classical arguments for the existence of God, and if they're not convinced by those arguments, be able to explain either which premise in the argument they don't think is true, or what fallacy, so civic logical fallacy, the argument commits.
Hey, that's basically my whole channel at this point. Yay!
Now, let me address a few objections to this argument that I'm offering. One objection is that theists, all they have to do to prove God exists is just offer repeatable, testable predictions of the God hypothesis, and that would prove God exists.
Well, we've already kind of touched on this. It would be a massive step in the right direction, but I honestly can't think of anything that would actually prove one religion over another, given the existence of so many malicious gods in the various religions that might want to trick humanity into believing the wrong thing. So, while it would be a step in the right direction, it doesn't quite get you there.
This is basically saying, well, if you can scientifically prove God exists, then atheists would change their minds. But what is science? Like, what is science? Science is the search for natural explanations of observed phenomena.
That is specifically the aspect of science known as methodological naturalism, yes, but here's the thing with that. If the supernatural existed and interacted with our world in a detectable manner, then methodological naturalism would never have been developed in the first place because it wouldn't be an accurate method of learning about reality. So given that the best way we have for learning about reality precludes the idea that supernatural forces are at work, it seems reasonable to conclude that supernatural forces are not at work in our world.
If we could show something was testable, predictable part of our world, whatever effect that might be, like let's say only Catholic priests can change water into wine when they say certain words. Say we do show that. Why wouldn't we conclude this is just an unexplained part of nature?
And now we get back to the crux of the matter. This is all entirely hypothetical, because the world works in exactly the way we would expect it to if no God existed. So yeah, hypothetically, if only Catholic priests could convert water into wine, there may be some hypothetical naturalistic explanation for that phenomenon, but that wouldn't be the default expectation if God did not exist. We would just expect nobody to be able to turn water into wine if no God exists, and that's what we see. So we are once again at a place where that would be a step in the right direction, but so far, apologists only seem to be capable of taking hypothetical steps in the right direction rather than actual steps. I mean, who knows? Maybe despite all our bluster, most atheists would be convinced by such things. We can't actually know for sure until such things actually start happening. So put up or shut up, I guess. Oh man, this was so cordial up till now. Oh well. Don't feel bad. Despite Trent appearing to be one of the more reasonable apologists that I've dealt with, there is plenty of nutbaggery underneath, and it's not hard to find. Within seconds of doing my basic background search to make sure I'm not responding to a version of Christianity that he doesn't believe in, I found an article where he bemoans the fact that people wouldn't tolerate arguments against contraception nowadays that are based on homophobia. I'm just gonna put this up for no particular reason. So, yeah. I don't actually feel bad about being less than cordial here. Oh, God damn it. I didn't even really get rude. Suck a dick, Trent. You might like it. I wonder why people take Apologia seriously, but not me.
This objection is basically saying, I'll believe a supernatural being exists if you can prove it is a regular part of the natural world that we observe. But that's a contradiction. You're saying that you'll believe in the supernatural when you can show me it is a part of nature, because science provides natural explanations for the things that we observe.
And that seems like an admission that the supernatural does not interact in any detectable way with our world, which honestly sounds fine to me. Not sure what the distinction is between that and it just not existing in the first place.
The point is, you cannot prove God exists with science. Science studies material causes, effects, and forces. God's existence is something you would demonstrate philosophically, like other immaterial things you would demonstrate philosophically.
That's not how Old Testament God seemed to see it. He had no problem fucking people's shit right up to prove that he was real. I wonder what changed.
Such as the existence of minds, moral truths, or numbers and other abstract objects.
I would argue that you can't actually demonstrate the existence of minds. I'm only aware of mine because I'm in it, and I find the idea that other people that are acting as though they have minds of their own do so because they do have minds of their own to be a reasonable one. So I have no problem living with that as an axiomatic assumption. As to moral truths, I'm not convinced that moral truths are real in the sense that they would exist if moral agents did not exist. It seems to me that what we consider to be moral truths are our opinions based on our feelings that have developed largely through our evolution as a social species. And numbers are just how we conceptualize quantification of things. They're not an inherent part of nature, as far as I can tell. We invented math to describe reality. Reality is not inherently mathematical.
An atheist might say, well, God is all-knowing. So even if an atheist personally doesn't know what would convince him, God knows what would convince him. And therefore, God could just show that person the evidence he needs, and he won't be ignorant about God anymore.
My God, it's like he's been listening to me.
I think one way to address these objections is to shift the question away from what evidence would convince you that God exists to what evidence would make it reasonable for someone to believe God exists.
I don't think that's really helpful here, because reasonableness is just as subjective a metric as the concept of what it would take to convince me. It's just externalizing the same thing. Though, to be fair, some of the examples I already gave would meet this mark. Again, I'm not sure if they would actually convince me, but if Christians all had magical healing powers like the Bible says they do, then I would at least think that the belief in Christianity is a reasonable one. The problem once again lies in the fact that all of these scenarios are purely hypothetical, because the reality of the situation is that reality behaves just as you would expect it to if there were no God.
You see, being convinced of something, being convinced seems to be almost a matter of like personal taste. For example, I could ask Matt Dillahunty, how would you know that what convinced you that God exists actually gave you a good reason to believe God exists? I mean, people are often convinced of false things. So the fact that something convinces Matt Dillahunty to believe, it doesn't mean it's a good reason.
And conversely, you can have good reason to believe things that are not true. When I find a bunch of shredded tissues on my bed, I have good reason to believe that the dog got into the garbage again, because for some reason she loves snotty Kleenex and apparently wants to make sure it gets on my pillow specifically. But there have been times when it turned out that a child was to blame, so it was reasonable to believe that the dog did it, but that would have been a false belief.
Saying that what would convince Matt Dillahunty to believe is just what would convince him is circular. It reduces the debate over God's existence to whether certain external observations merely cause us to have convincing internal feelings rather than following a process of reasoning. That's why I think it's better to ask whether certain beliefs are reasonable or unreasonable, and then use our reason to follow the arguments made in favor of those beliefs to see if either one of the premises is not true, or we have no good reason to think it's true, or there's been an error in the reasoning or a fallacy.
Would you consider a belief to be unreasonable if it hits one of those marks? Because you've already basically conceded that the arguments for God all make use of the God of the gaps fallacy. So if that's our standard, then no, belief in God is not reasonable.
After all, you can think something is reasonable even if it doesn't convince you. And that seems to take us more into the domain of reason than the domain of feelings.
Okay, but there's no shortage of apologists making it explicitly clear that feelings are what convince people that God is real. So this seems like, once again, it may be a bit of a moot point. And I just so happen to have a montage of apologists saying just that. So let's go ahead and give that a little looky-loo, shall we?
Learn to circumnavigate or go around the person's intellect, the place of argument, and to speak directly to their conscience.
I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this.
The Kalam cosmological argument, I go, that's a really good argument for God's existence, but I don't know how much it strikes people's emotions. I look at the moral argument and I go, that one hits people's emotions and it's intellectually strong as well.
Those lines are all meant to touch the heart, to go right past, in a sense, the intellect, and to speak directly to the existential awareness people have.
Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it. I think that this is a message which is so wonderful, so fantastic, that if there's any evidence that it's true, then it's worth believing in.
As Paulogia so astutely observed in his recent video covering apologist reaction to Rhett McLaughlin's interview with Alex O'Connor, it seems as though nothing more than pleasant feelings are all that is necessary to become a believing Christian. But if you should ever want to leave Christianity, you better have read every goddamn apologetics book there is and be fully prepared to respond to every single claim using nothing but facts and logic. Otherwise, you obviously weren't really a Christian to begin with, or didn't give Christianity a fair shake, or something along those lines.
So I'd ask an atheist, could it ever be reasonable for someone to believe God exists?
Using the criteria that you laid out here and taking your admission that arguments for God are all based on the God of the gaps fallacy into consideration, no. But in the hypothetical world where only Catholic priests can turn water into wine, or where Christians can heal amputees, yes, it could be reasonable. I'd even go so far as to say that if you had a personal experience that you are convinced was genuine, then in our actual real world, belief in God could still be reasonable. But as I have already pointed out, reasonable beliefs can be wrong, and I would argue that it is at least as reasonable to doubt the existence of God based on the complete lack of anything approaching actual evidence.
So let me return to the title of this video, which I admit it's a bit of a generalization, but video titles can kind of be that way. I said there's one question atheists can't answer, and that's what would prove God exists? I said it's not helpful to frame the question as what would convince you God exists, since that's more about feelings than rational discourse. I'd rather ask an atheist, can a person rationally believe in God? And if so, under what circumstances could that take place?
Okay, you're changing the language of the question, though. I've already said that it could be reasonable to believe in God, but now you're asking if it could be rational. Those two words are often used interchangeably, but when we're getting into the philosophical weeds regarding arguments for God, we need to be careful and intentional with our language. And if we're digging up rationality, we now have to distinguish between the different kinds of rationality. Are we talking about normative rationality, which explains how people ideally should make decisions based on logic and reason, taking all possible data into account, whether the person knows about the data or not? Or are we talking about descriptive rationality, which explains why people actually make decisions based on the knowledge that they actually have, combined with their desired outcomes? So, for example, if someone pursues a PhD in some obscure field of anthropology with very few career opportunities, then we could say that from a normative perspective, they should have chosen a field with better prospects. But from a descriptive perspective, they chose the field that they are passionate about and derive more fulfillment from. So the normatively irrational choice was the descriptively rational choice. All this to say that, yes, belief in God can be rational, but that depends heavily on what you mean by the word rational. I didn't even get into prescriptive rationality, or what happens when you mix and match between these three views.
It's not helpful to say, well, under this miracle, this specific miracle, or that specific miracle, it'd be reasonable to believe. Because those are just examples of sufficient evidence, subjective examples. They aren't objective definitions of what level of evidence would be sufficient for anyone to believe.
That's because it's actually impossible to objectively define the level of evidence required for everyone to believe, because that is an inherently subjective metric. What it will take to convince someone will vary from person to person based on their dispositions, their lived experiences, their prior knowledge of the subject, their current state of mind, etc., etc., etc.
So here's my new question then for an atheist, and one you could ask an atheist or an agnostic or non-believing friend. It'd be this. What is the best argument for the existence of God? And what's wrong with it? Or what is the least problematic argument for God? And what's specifically wrong with it?
And this is honestly a really tough question, because I don't find any arguments for God to be even the slightest bit convincing. Best I could give you is that the cosmological argument gets to places where the scientific counter to the gap that it sticks God into is full of stuff that I just will never understand, not even in the slightest. But that is itself the problem with it. It is the argument that I have the hardest time dealing with because it deals with a subject where there are a lot of unknowns for me. As in, the knowledge gap that God gets stuck into is bigger than the other arguments that I'm familiar with, so that's why I have a harder time with it. I don't see how that could be convincing.
Remember, to show something is wrong with an argument, you need to point out either an untrue premise in the argument or some kind of fallacy in the reasoning, specific fallacy, not just like, it's God of the gaps. What specific logical fallacy is being committed?
I mean, I guess if you want to get technical, the proper term for the God of the gaps fallacy is actually the argument from ignorance, which is the phrase I used for it before Trent started using God of the gaps to reference it. So that is the specific fallacy. I'm not sure what more you want than that. I'm happy to acknowledge the fact that a fallacious argument can have a conclusion that is true, so saying that the arguments for God are fallacious does not automatically mean that God does not exist, but it does invalidate those particular arguments. But hey, if we want to get robust, let's use the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe had a cause. Despite everything I've said up to this point, this argument does not make use of the argument from ignorance fallacy. But you'll notice something else about it. Despite apologists regularly using it as an argument for God, it actually only gets you to a cause for the universe. So even if I stop here and don't point out the composition fallacy that it makes use of, it doesn't work as an argument for God. But it also does make use of the composition fallacy, which is where you infer that something is true of a whole from the fact that it is true of the parts of the whole. We don't know that causality as we understand it within the universe is applicable in the same way to the universe as a whole, so the conclusion does not follow from these premises. It also makes use of the equivocation fallacy, where the same word or phrase is used in multiple senses in one argument. In this case, the phrase begins to exist. In the first premise, that everything begins to exist has a cause, we are talking about things beginning to exist within the universe. But everything that begins to exist within the universe is not beginning in the same way as the universe as a whole. Everything within the universe is technically a rearranging of pre-existing energy and material. But when we get to premise 2, with the universe beginning to exist, apologists will usually explain this as being created out of nothing. There was nothing, now there's a universe. That is not using begins to exist in the same sense as we understand it within the universe. So there you go. 2 fallacies in one of the most robust arguments that apologists use, and they're not even the argument from ignorance fallacy, which inevitably comes up once you try to connect cause of the universe to God of the Bible. And that's it for this one. He just goes into book recommendations from there. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Steve Weber 707, who says, saying that the disciples disappeared from reliable history requires them to be in reliable history accounts. To which I say, Yeah, we can be pretty confident in Peter's existence based on Paul having written about going to meet him in Galatians, but given how a bunch of the disciples got smushed together in church tradition when it became apparent that each of the Gospels had different people on the list of Jesus' 12 disciples, I do feel pretty confident in saying that at least some of them were themselves a part of the legendary growth of the story. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to surfshark.com/ViceRhino to get 4 extra months for free. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the ignorance that is relied upon by the argument that is my channel. If you'd like to be a fallacy, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description, and you can go to throne.com/ViceRhino to buy something off my wish list. It's just a couple of hard drives at the moment. See you next time. Either doesn't care all that much. Do not disturb for 2 hours. That's sticking right out my ear. Not well. That I mean, my ear's not that high, but God damn it, I'm gonna find a better spot for it. Probably not keep my clap position. What? I don't know what's going on anymore.